Close your eyes for a second. Actually, don't. You're watching a video. But imagine it. Imagine standing on a hillside somewhere in East Africa, 100,000 years ago. You are anatomically modern. Your brain is the same size as yours right now. Your eyes work the same way. Your capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for looking at a landscape and feeling something about it. All of that is fully operational. But the world in front of you is not the world you know, not even close. The sky is the same sky. The stars at night are the same stars. The sun rises and sets in the same rhythm. But everything at ground level, the animals, the plants, the shape of the coastlines, the reach of the forests, the position of the glaciers, the depth of the seas, all of it is different in ways that range from subtle to staggering. The Earth that early humans looked out at every morning was a genuinely alien version of the planet we inhabit today, and understanding that difference changes how you think about everything our ancestors experienced. So let's go there. Let's actually look at what they saw. The first thing you need to understand is water, specifically where it was. Today, the world's oceans cover about 71% of the planet's surface at a particular depth that we treat as normal, because it's the only one we've ever known. But sea level is not fixed. It never has been. It responds to the amount of water locked up in glaciers and ice sheets on land. When ice builds up, sea levels drop because water is being removed from the oceans and stored on land as frozen mass. When ice melts, sea levels rise as that water returns. This cycle has been running for millions of years, and the specific moment we happen to exist in is not representative of the average. During the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. That's not a rounding error. That's a number that rewrites the map of the world so completely that someone looking at both versions side by side would struggle to believe they were the same planet. At 120 meters lower sea level, enormous areas of what are today ocean floor were dry land. Productive, habitable, populated dry land. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe didn't exist. Britain was not an island. You could walk from London to Amsterdam across a vast plain that archaeologists now call Doggerland, a low-lying landscape of rivers, wetlands, and forests that was home to human populations for thousands of years before it was swallowed by rising seas around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Occasional finds of mammoth bones and Mesolithic tools dredged up by fishing nets from the bottom of the North Sea are its ghost. Evidence of a world that existed and was lost not to catastrophe, but to the slow, inexorable rise of water. Similar stories play out everywhere you look. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land, a river valley cutting through exposed continental shelf where people lived and hunted for tens of thousands of years. The Bering Land Bridge, Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska, and it wasn't a narrow strip of land, but a subcontinental landmass hundreds of kilometers wide, supporting its own distinct ecosystem of woolly mammoths, bison, and cave lions. This is the highway that humans almost certainly used to first enter the Americas, and it's now under the Bering Sea with no surface trace of the people who crossed it. The islands of Southeast Asia were not the scattered archipelago they are today. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were all connected to mainland Asia in a single giant peninsula that geologists call Sundaland, a tropical landmass larger than India that has since been drowned entirely by rising seas. Australia and New Guinea were joined into a single continent, which researchers call Sahul. The crossing from Sundaland to Sahul was the first time in the history of life that a large-brained mammal deliberately crossed open ocean in significant numbers. The ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians making a sea crossing of at least 70 to 90 kilometers, probably more, around 65,000 years ago. That crossing required watercraft and navigational intent, which means the people who did it could look out at open water and understand, in some meaningful way, that there was something on the other side worth reaching. That is, A remarkable cognitive fact about people we sometimes still imagine as primitive or reactive. They were neither. They were sailors. The Mediterranean was smaller and saltier, with different coastline configurations along its southern margins. The Red Sea was narrower in several places. Ireland and Britain were both connected to continental Europe. Ceylon, Sri Lanka, was connected to India by a broad land bridge. Taiwan was connected to mainland China. The world's coastlines, which we treat as fixed and essentially permanent features of the map, were not fixed at all. They were moving targets, shifting over human-scale timescales as ice ages came and went, drowning familiar territories and exposing new ones in a geological rhythm that early humans experienced not as science, but as the lived reality of their world changing within a human lifetime. Here is the part that deserves to sit with you for a moment. Entire human populations lived on these now drowned landscapes. They built their lives there, raised their children there, developed their knowledge of local plants and animals and water sources, and understood their world in terms of specific places that no longer exist above water. The stories they told about those places, the names they had for specific hills and rivers and hunting grounds, all of it was transmitted generation after generation as the water rose until the places the stories described were beneath the waves and the stories became, to later generations, something that sounded like myth. There are researchers who think that some of humanity's most persistent flood myths, the biblical flood, the Mesopotamian flood story of Utnapishtim, the flood narratives in Hindu tradition, the Aboriginal Australian stories of the sea rising to drown the coastal lands, are not pure invention. They are distorted but genuine cultural memories of real events. The drowning of real coastlines where real people lived, passed down in story form across dozens of generations until the specific geography was lost, but the emotional truth of a world swallowed by water remained. Whether or not you find that compelling, the underlying reality is not in dispute. The floods happened. The lands went under. People had to move. Whether the memory of those specific inundations survived across thousands of years of oral transmission is genuinely one of the most interesting open questions in the archaeology of human memory. Now let's look up. The night sky over a Paleolithic campsite was something that no person alive today in any city on Earth has ever seen with their own eyes. Not because the sky itself was different, the stars were where they were, but because the darkness was absolute in a way that modern humans have essentially no reference for. Light pollution is so pervasive in the contemporary world that roughly a third of humanity cannot see the Milky Way from where they live. The orange glow of cities on the horizon is visible from hundreds of kilometers away. True, complete, unpolluted darkness, the kind where your eyes fully adapt and the sky becomes a three-dimensional thing, layered with depth, crowded with stars in numbers that seem impossible, is something most modern humans have never experienced, and, living where they live, never will. Ancient humans experienced it every night of their lives. It was not a special occasion or a camping trip. It was Tuesday. The Milky Way would have been a dominant feature of the sky. Not a faint smudge on a good night, but a blazing, textured band of light complex enough to see real structure within. Dark lanes and bright clusters visible to the naked eye. The galactic disk pressing down on you overhead with its sheer number of visible stars. Individual planets were among the brightest objects in the sky and moved in ways visibly different from the fixed stars, making them obvious and notable to any regular observer. Meteor showers, comets, auroras at higher latitudes, all visible in a clarity and intensity that modern humans rarely encounter even in supposedly dark rural areas far from cities. This mattered not just aesthetically, but practically. Navigation by stars, tracking of seasons and lunar cycles for planning migrations and predicting food availability. The night sky was a tool as much as a spectacle. Hunter-gatherer peoples who understood the sky in detail were better equipped to plan travel, to time their movements to the rhythms of the natural world, and to predict the seasonal availability of resources that their survival depended on. Astronomical knowledge was not an academic pursuit, it was survival infrastructure. The Pleiades star cluster appears in the mythological and navigational traditions of cultures from Australia to North America to Africa to Europe, almost always associated with the same seasonal events: planting, harvest, the movement of fish runs, the beginning of rains. This near-universal cultural significance is not coincidence. It reflects the fact that these 7 bright stars, rising and setting at specific times of year with a precision you can rely on, served as a natural calendar visible to anyone who looked up on a clear night, which our ancestors did every night. With eyes adapted to darkness, we have largely engineered out of existence and minds primed to find patterns in what they observed. Now let's talk about the animals. The world that early modern humans inhabited was full of large animals in a way that the modern world simply is not, and the difference in scale is almost impossible to overstate. The term is megafauna, animals above roughly 44 kilograms, and in the Pleistocene, megafauna were abundant, diverse, and present on every continent in numbers and varieties that dwarf anything alive today. In Africa, where Homo sapiens evolved, the megafauna were most extensive because African animals had the longest coexistence with our lineage and had the most time to develop behavioral responses to human hunting. Even so, the Africa of 100,000 years ago was significantly richer in large animal diversity than the Africa of today. Multiple species of elephant, multiple species of rhinoceros, giant buffalo with horns spanning 2 meters. Enormous predators including species of big cat now entirely extinct. The diversity was staggering even on the continent where it survived longest. In Europe and Asia, the picture was more dramatic still. Woolly mammoths, full-sized adults standing up to 3.5 meters tall at the shoulder, with tusks up to 4 meters long, weighing 6 tons or more. Woolly rhinoceroses built for cold environments. Cave lions, larger than any modern lion, hunting in the same landscape as human groups. Cave hyenas, significantly bigger than spotted hyenas today, competing directly with humans for carcasses. Giant deer, the megaloceros, with antler spans of 3.7 meters, wider than a modern car is long, who somehow navigated forested terrain with that extraordinary architecture on their heads, which remains one of the more puzzling engineering choices in the fossil record. Cave bears, enormous animals that shared the cave systems humans also used for shelter, making unoccupied caves a resource worth fighting over. Straight-tusked elephants, forest-dwelling giants even larger than woolly mammoths. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle ancestral to every domestic breed alive today, standing nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder with a temperament that matched their size exactly. When early Homo sapiens moved into Europe around 45,000 years ago, they walked into this, a landscape defined by animals that no modern human has ever shared a continent with. The scale and density of large animal life would have been overwhelming by any modern standard. Herds of mammoths visible across open tundra, packs of cave hyenas, and lions competing for the same carcasses humans wanted, giant deer browsing at the forest edge in the evening light. The paintings on the walls of Lascaux and Chauvet and Altamira are not imagination or artistic license. They are portraits from life, made by people who watched these animals constantly and knew their shapes and movements with the intimacy that comes from sharing a world with something that is simultaneously food and predator. In the Americas, when humans arrived around 15,000 years ago or possibly earlier, they found megafauna so abundant it makes modern Africa look restrained. Woolly mammoths and mastodons. Giant ground sloths the size of small elephants. Slow-moving, but so large that few predators could reliably take an adult. Glyptodonts, armored animals the size of small cars, essentially giant armadillos with spiked tails used as weapons. Short-faced bears with longer legs and a faster running speed than any modern bear, which is a sentence worth reading twice. American lions and American cheetahs. Dire wolves in large coordinated packs. Horses, camels, and tapirs, all native to the Americas before their extinction. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth up to 28 centimeters long. All of this was gone within a few thousand years of sustained human presence in each region. The megafauna extinction remains debated. Climate change, human hunting, or some lethal combination? But the timing is consistent enough across continents that it's difficult to fully exonerate our species. Wherever humans arrived in numbers, the large animals disappeared on a geological timescale that amounts to almost immediately. The world our ancestors inhabited was defined by those animals. The world that came after was defined by their absence, and we are so accustomed to that absence that we don't even recognize it as a loss. The vegetation was different too, and in ways that go well beyond simple species composition. During the last ice age, what is now the Sahara Desert was not desert. It was a landscape of grasslands, lakes, and rivers. The Green Sahara, a period roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, when a shift in the African monsoon system brought dramatically more rainfall to North Africa and transformed one of the world's great deserts into a habitable savanna populated by hippos, crocodiles, elephants, cattle herders, and fishing communities living beside lakes that no longer exist. Rock art left by those people survives in places like the Tassili N'Ajjer Plateau in Algeria, showing cattle herding, swimming, and animals now absent from the Sahara by thousands of kilometers. The desert that seems like a permanent geographical fact was, very recently in human terms, a fundamentally different place. When it dried, the people who lived in it had to leave. Many probably moved to the Nile Valley, contributing to the population pressures and social complexity that eventually produced ancient Egypt. The Sahara didn't just dry out, it pushed people somewhere. The Amazon, often described as pristine wilderness, shows increasing evidence of having been substantially managed and modified by human populations for thousands of years before European contact. Terra preta, patches of unusually fertile dark earth distributed across the Amazon basin, appears to result from long-term deliberate human habitation and soil management practices. Geometric earthworks visible beneath the forest canopy indicate organized landscape modification at significant scale. What looks like untouched wilderness to modern eyes was, in significant part, a managed landscape whose managers are no longer there. Nature reclaimed it over 5 centuries of post-contact depopulation, but that doesn't mean nature made it. Now for something that almost never comes up in discussions of the ancient world. Rivers. The river systems of the Pleistocene were substantially different from those of today. In many regions, rivers were larger, more numerous, and more variable in their flow, fed by glacial meltwater and a different precipitation pattern. The Sahara was full of rivers that are now dry wadis, ghost valleys carved by water that hasn't flowed in millennia. The Arabian Peninsula had river systems that are now desert. Europe had rivers draining across what is now the seabed of the North Sea, eventually meeting the Thames and the Rhine in a combined drainage system flowing north across Doggerland. Rivers were the highways of the ancient world. They provided water, food, navigation routes, and the reliable resource concentrations that hunter-gatherer groups depended on. Many of the major population concentrations in prehistoric Europe and Asia were along river valleys that still exist today, but others were along rivers that are now gone, drowned under rising seas, or dried by shifting climate. The human geography of the Pleistocene world was organized around a river network that has been substantially dismantled by the same climate shifts that ended the Ice Age and raised the seas. The climate itself was different in ways that went beyond ice sheets and coastlines. The Pleistocene was characterized by rapid oscillations between glacial and interglacial periods, with some transitions happening over timescales of centuries. For humans living through those transitions, the world of their childhood could be visibly different from the world of their old age. Forests advancing over the grasslands where they had hunted as children, rivers drying that had been year-round in their parents' memory. seasonal rhythms shifting in ways that made the inherited knowledge about when to move and where to find food suddenly unreliable. The world was not a stable background. It was a changing character in the story. Some researchers argue that this instability was a primary driver of human cognitive evolution, that our capacity for behavioral flexibility, for complex planning, for learning and transmitting knowledge was sharpened by the pressure of a world that changed faster than genetics could track. Groups that could hold complex knowledge, revise it rapidly in response to new conditions, and transmit updated strategies across generations survived transitions that eliminated groups that couldn't adapt fast enough. The intelligence that feels so distinctly and uniquely human may be, at its root, a climate adaptation. A brain built for a world that wouldn't sit still. There is something almost vertiginous about that idea. The capacity that allows you to understand this sentence, to hold abstract concepts in mind, to imagine a future you haven't lived yet, that capacity may owe its existence to ice ages and the desperate cognitive demands they placed on your ancestors. You are thinking thoughts with a brain that was built by weather. The sounds of the ancient world deserve a moment, because this is the dimension of the past we can least reconstruct and that we have most completely lost. Before the internal combustion engine, before electrical infrastructure, before the mechanical hum underlying every moment of modern life in every inhabited place on Earth, the world was acoustically open in a way it no longer is. The sounds were natural sounds entirely: wind, water, animal calls, insects, weather moving across a landscape. The approach of an animal at a significant distance, the behavior of birds signaling a predator's presence nearby, the specific quality of silence that told you something large was very close. These were readable signals in an acoustic environment that had no background noise to mask them. Early humans were embedded in that soundscape and read it fluently, automatically, with immediate practical comprehension of what each sound meant. The forest was talking all the time. They understood the language. The world that ancient humans looked out at was also a world without recorded history in our sense. They did not know they were living in an ice age. They did not know the mammoths would be gone within a few thousand years. They did not know the sea was rising incrementally under their feet, that the land their children played on would become the floor of a shallow sea in a dozen generations. They lived in the present of their world with an immediacy and an intimacy that our knowledge of deep time makes impossible for us to fully replicate. And yet they left evidence of something that looks unmistakably like wonder. The cave paintings are the most dramatic evidence. Animals rendered with a skill and an attention to living movement that required careful, repeated observation of real subjects in the field. The handprints stenciled on cave walls across every inhabited continent, saying in the most direct language possible, "I was here, this was my hand, I existed in this place, and I wanted you to know it." The carved figures, the grave goods, the ochre-stained bones of the carefully buried dead, implying something. Beliefs about death, about what followed it, about the significance of a person's remains. That is deeply recognizable even across 100,000 years of distance. They looked out at that extraordinary, teeming, unpolluted, incomprehensibly alive world, at the mammoths on the tundra and the Milky Way blazing without competition overhead and the coastlines that hadn't yet gone under. And they felt something we would recognize immediately. We just can't see what they were seeing. And that, more than anything else, is the loss.